Her name was Naomi Reed, and on the night the entire Ashford family raised their glasses to celebrate the new heir, she was called a temporary woman in front of nearly 100 guests. No one stood up to defend her. Not one person. Not even Caleb, the husband who had once held her hands at the altar and promised that she would never have to stand alone in this family. The party was held at the very first Ashford Harbor Hotel, located beside the Charleston Harbor, where golden light reflected against tall glass windows and the sound of crystal glasses touching rang out with a clarity that felt like it belonged only to the wealthy. On the walls were black and white photographs of the Ashford family across generations. The grandfather stood in the center. Her father-in-law stood beside him. Vivian Ashford smiled proudly in every frame, as if she herself had given birth to that entire bloodline from marble and power. Naomi sat at the table near the side door, where servers passed back and forth constantly, not at the center table, not beside Caleb, not beside the people they called the core family. That seating arrangement needed no explanation. It had already said enough. Vivian was very good at that. She did not need to shout. She did not need to insult anyone openly. She only needed a thin smile, a slight tilt of her head, and a sentence that sounded polite but cut deeper than a knife. Naomi knew that kind of cruelty well. 3 years as a daughter-in-law in the Ashford family had taught her that some families did not shut the door in an outsider's face. They opened it, invited them in, placed them in a lower chair than everyone else, and called it kindness. That night, Ashford Harbor Group was celebrating 40 years since its founding. Investors were there, local media was there. Relatives who had not appeared in years also showed up, dressed in silk gowns, wearing antique jewelry, speaking about legacy as if it were blood running through their veins rather than numbers buried inside bank records. Preston Ashford stood up to speak first. He was Caleb's older brother, the man Vivian always introduced as the future of the family. Preston had the smile of someone who had never once doubted that he would win. He spoke about the Ashford bloodline, about loyalty, about the responsibility to protect the legacy. Every word he said landed in the room like another brick placed beneath a throne. Naomi sat still. She felt her hand grow cold against the white napkin. She was not jealous of Preston, she was only tired. Tired of listening to people who had never protected anything with their own hands speak the loudest about sacrifice. Then Vivian stood up. The room immediately softened. Every pair of eyes turned toward her. Vivian lifted her champagne glass, slowly looked around the room, and finally let her gaze settle on Naomi. For one very brief moment, Naomi saw Caleb lower his head slightly. He knew. He always knew before his mother struck. Vivian said that some people were born into a family, and some people merely passed through it for one season of life. The laughter spread very softly, not loudly, not crudely. That was exactly why it hurt more. It was the kind of laughter that came from people who understood the insult but chose to treat it as entertainment. Naomi looked at Caleb. He did not laugh, but he said nothing either. His silence was heavier than the laughter of the entire room. Preston took a sip of wine, his eyes bright with pleasure. He had been waiting for this moment. To him, Naomi was only a lucky woman who had married Caleb, a soft name sitting on the edge of the Ashford family tree, someone with no right to ask, no right to know, and certainly no right to inherit. But at the far end of the room, Aunt Beatrice Vale was not laughing. The 82-year-old woman sat upright in a chair covered in green velvet, her gray eyes fixed on Naomi without blinking. Beatrice was the younger sister of the man the whole family had once called the founder of Ashford. She rarely spoke, lived alone, and almost never attended parties. Her presence that night had already made Vivian uncomfortable. Naomi noticed it when she saw Vivian look toward Beatrice with a warning in her eyes, but Beatrice did not look away. As dessert was about to be served, Beatrice placed her napkin on the table. She gestured to a young server. He hurried into the hallway, then returned with an old dark brown leather bag. It did not look like a gift. It looked like something that had been kept in the dark for far too long. The entire room slowly fell silent. Preston was the first to laugh, saying that perhaps Naomi was finally receiving her inheritance, a few old vacation photos and a little dust. This time, not many people laughed with him. Vivian turned pale. Only slightly. But Naomi saw it. Caleb saw it too. Preston did not. Beatrice placed the leather bag in front of Naomi. Her voice was low, dry, and clear with every word. She told Naomi to open it before anyone in that room was allowed to announce the future of the family. Naomi looked at the tarnished brass lock. Her heart began to beat faster. She did not yet know what was inside, but she knew one thing. Vivian was afraid. And for the first time in 3 years, the frightened person in that room was not Naomi. Naomi did not open the bag right away. She placed her hand on the old leather surface, feeling the dry cracks running beneath her fingertips, as if that bag had lived through more years of silence than a human being. The entire ballroom waited. The champagne glasses still glittered under the chandelier, but the laughter was gone. No one was talking about Preston's speech anymore. No one was looking at the stage. Every eye was on Naomi, and the dark brown leather bag lying in front of her. Vivian stood not far away, her hand tightening around the stem of her glass. She was still smiling, but the smile no longer had its edge. It had stiffened, like a layer of paint cracking under harsh light. Preston frowned, irritated that attention had been pulled away from him. Caleb stared down at the floor, as if the patterns in the carpet could save him from this moment. Beatrice did not rush her. She simply sat still, her aged but alert eyes fixed on Naomi. There was no pity in that gaze. Only a very long, very deep kind of waiting, as if she had kept this bag through many winters, just to place it into the right hands when the time finally came. At last, Naomi opened the lock. A small click sounded, very soft. But in that perfectly silent room, it sounded like the door of a sealed basement opening after years of being locked. There was no camera inside, no jewelry, nothing that looked like a family gift. There were only old envelopes, a stack of black and white photographs, several yellow drawings, and a blue notebook tied shut with a strip of cloth. Naomi took out the first photograph. It showed an old inn beside the harbor, with a low roof, peeling walls, and windows warped by the sea wind. On the back of the photograph was handwriting, soft but firm. First revision. Paid in full, March 1983. Signed, Lydia Reid. Naomi stopped breathing. Lydia Reid was her mother's name. For a moment the room seemed to move farther away. The sound of knives and forks, the background music, the whispers, all of it blurred into a dull layer of noise. Naomi looked at that name, at every stroke of the handwriting, and felt a buried part of her childhood suddenly reach out and touch her. Since she was little, she had only ever been told that her mother had worked for the Ashford family for a few months. A poor woman with some talent for decorating, hired to make the guest rooms look nicer before tourist season. Then she died. The story always ended there, short, cold, no one added details. No one wanted to remember. But the photograph in Naomi's hand did not say that. She picked up another drawing. It was the design for the lobby of the first Ashford Harbor Hotel. A curved staircase, an oak reception desk, glass doors facing the sea. In the lower corner was Lydia Reid's signature. Not the signature of a hired decorator, it was the signature of the woman who had designed the entire soul of that place. Beatrice spoke, her voice dropping lower. Your mother did not decorate that hotel. She saved it. Vivian immediately took one step forward. She said old documents could easily be misunderstood. Her voice was still gentle, but beneath that softness, Naomi could hear the sound of fingernails scraping against glass. Preston gave a harsh little laugh and said a few sketches could not change Ashford history. That was when Beatrice turned to him. Which history, Preston? The history that was recorded, or the history your mother paid people to believe? No one laughed anymore. Naomi opened the second envelope. Inside was a bank transfer document. The sender was Lydia Reid. The recipient was a local bank in Charleston. The note clearly stated that the money was a deposit to secure the lease rights to the harborfront land, the very place where the first Ashford Hotel had been built. The amount was not small. It was large enough that Naomi had to read it twice. She looked up at Caleb. His face was deathly pale. He had known that name before. She could see it in his eyes. It was not complete surprise. It was the fear of someone who had once seen a corner of the truth and chosen to turn away. Naomi asked him very softly if he had known her mother was connected to the hotel records. Caleb opened his mouth, then fell silent. The answer was right there in that silence. A cold pain moved through Naomi's chest, not because of Vivian, not because of Preston. She was used to their contempt. But Caleb was the one who had said he was different from them. Caleb was the one who had promised that inside that house, at least she still had him. Beatrice glanced toward the blue notebook. Naomi opened it. The first page was Lydia's handwriting. Notes about repair costs. The first customer list. The names of suppliers for curtains, wood, lamps, and beds. The lines were careful, dense, and full of life. Her mother had not only designed this place, she had counted every dollar, made every call, negotiated every contract. Then Naomi saw one underlined line. Vivian wants to use the Ashford name on the sign. She says investors trust an old family name more than they trust a woman with no backing. The glass in Vivian's hand tapped lightly against the table. The sound made everyone turn to look at her. Naomi understood. The entire room was beginning to understand, too. The family story the Ashfords had told for 40 years was not missing a few details. It had been built on a name that had been erased. Then, at the bottom of the bag, Naomi found a cream-colored envelope. Her name was written on the front in her mother's handwriting. Naomi Reed. Inside was a copy of a will. Her hand trembled slightly when she reached the beneficiary section. All rights, profits, and assets connected to Lydia Reid's original investment would be transferred to her daughter when she came of age. Not Naomi thought that was the final blow. But behind the will, there was one more bank document. Naomi's inheritance account had been closed when she had just reached adulthood. The person who signed the order to close the account was Vivian Ashford. Naomi read the bank document one more time, so slowly that every word seemed to scrape across her eyes. Her inheritance account had been closed the year she had just reached adulthood. There was no signature from her, no notice sent to her, not even a single phone call. There was only the name Vivian Ashford on the confirmation line. The room was no longer a gala. It had turned into a courtroom without a judge, where every crystal glass, every silk gown, every fake smile was testifying to a lie that had lived far too long. Vivian stepped forward, her voice still soft, but her eyes had lost all their usual elegance. She said Naomi did not understand legal documents, that this matter had been handled many years ago, that Lydia Reid had owed the Ashford family more than Naomi could ever imagine. Naomi looked up. She did not cry. That was exactly what unsettled Vivian. Vivian was used to watching people tremble in front of her. She was used to turning truth into misunderstanding, guilt into obligation, theft into a private family matter. But Naomi only looked at her with eyes so cold that Preston had to look away. Beatrice placed her hands on the table and slowly stood. Age had bent her shoulders slightly, but her voice was not weak. She said Vivian had 33 years to tell her version of the story. Now it was time for the documents to speak. Vivian immediately hissed her name, like a warning. But Beatrice did not stop. She explained that 8 months earlier, she had heard Preston was preparing to sell part of Ashford Harbor Group to an out-of-state investment fund. That deal would restructure all the assets, move ownership through several layers of new companies, and if it was signed, the traces of Lydia Reid's original investment would almost be buried forever. That was why Beatrice had started looking for everything again. Not because she wanted to destroy the Ashford family, but because she was too tired of watching a family call itself a legacy while standing on the name of a dead woman. Following Beatrice's instruction, Naomi opened the hidden compartment at the bottom of the leather bag. Inside was a newer stack of documents, arranged very carefully. A copy of the profit-sharing agreement, letters from Lydia to her lawyer, a calculation sheet showing the money Naomi should have received when she became an adult, and a printed chain of emails from the old Ashford law office. One line made Naomi feel her throat tighten. Delay disclosure until after the succession vote. There was no misunderstanding anymore. No oversight anymore. This was a plan. Preston slammed his hand on the table. The sharp sound made several guests flinch. He said Naomi was ruining the family's reputation, ruining the company, ruining an important night. He said she was not an Ashford, and she had no right to drag old matters in front of investors. Naomi looked at him for a long time. The man who had just raised his glass and spoken about bloodline and loyalty was now shaking because of a stack of old papers. She asked very softly that if she was not family, why had his mother needed her inheritance to build this family? No one answered. An investor standing near the stage stepped forward, his face turning serious. He asked Preston whether there was any legal dispute related to the original ownership of the first hotel. Preston opened his mouth, but the answer caught in his throat. The man who had been prepared to become CEO suddenly could not form a complete sentence. Vivian turned to Caleb. This time, she no longer hid the command in her voice. She told him to take his wife outside, to handle this like a husband, to not let an outsider tear the family apart. Caleb looked at Naomi. There was fear in his eyes. Regret, too, even pleading. But Naomi no longer needed any of that. She only needed one clear sentence. Just one time, she wanted the man who had once promised to protect her to stand on the side of the truth. Caleb swallowed hard, then said that maybe they should talk about this privately. That was all. A very small sentence, but it broke the last thing inside Naomi. Beatrice took a phone from her coat pocket, called her lawyer, and put the call on speaker. The lawyer's voice rang out dryly in the middle of the ballroom. He confirmed that Lydia's profit-sharing agreement was still valid. He confirmed that Naomi was the legal beneficiary. He confirmed that the closing of the account years earlier showed signs of serious irregularity. And he confirmed that a request for an audit, along with an order to pause the succession vote, had already been prepared. Preston turned pale. Vivian stepped back, half a step. Then the lawyer added one final thing. In Lydia's will, there was a protective clause. If the Ashford family deliberately concealed Naomi's rights, the voting rights related to the first hotel and the assets derived from it would transfer to a backup trust in Naomi's name. The room fell dead silent. Naomi was not only the person whose money had been stolen, she had the right to block the deal. She had the right to demand an audit. She had the right to drag the entire Ashford dynasty into the light. Vivian whispered that this had to stop immediately. Naomi closed the leather bag. The sound of the lock rang out clean, cold, and final. She looked straight at her mother-in-law and said that 33 years of privacy was enough. From now on, everything would go into the record. 33 years of silence ended with a leather bag closing in front of the entire Ashford family. No one clapped. No one raised a glass anymore. The band in the corner of the room was still playing very softly, but every note fell into the ballroom like shards of broken glass. The elegant guests began looking at one another with different eyes. No more admiration, no more respect. Only suspicion. Naomi stood in the middle of that room, her hand resting on her mother's old bag, and for the first time in 3 years as a daughter-in-law of the Ashford family, she did not feel small. Vivian tried to regain control. She said this was a private matter, a family misunderstanding, a night where emotions had gone too far. Her voice was still beautiful, still smooth, but no one listened the way they had before. Once the truth had stepped out of the darkness, polite words were nothing more than silk laid over blood. Naomi looked at her, calm in a way that was almost frightening. She said every deal related to Ashford Harbour Group would have to stop until an independent audit was completed. She said Preston's succession vote also had to be suspended. No one was allowed to sign more documents. No one was allowed to transfer assets. No one was allowed to hide records. Preston shot to his feet, his face flushed red. He said she had no right. The lawyer on the other end of the call answered for her. Naomi had the right to request a review. Naomi had the right to represent the backup trust. Naomi had the right to block any transaction related to assets that came from the first hotel. Every sentence fell like a hammer. Preston dropped back into his chair. The man who had just stood on stage speaking about the future of the family now looked like a child whose toy had been snatched away, a toy he had always believed was his. Caleb stepped closer to Naomi. He said her name very softly. There was regret in his voice, but regret that comes too late is often just another form of fear. Naomi looked at her husband and saw the final truth clearly. Caleb was not the cruelest person in that family. He was simply the one who had stood still for too long beside cruelty. She told him he no longer needed to explain for anyone, and he was not allowed to turn betrayal into inconvenience. That sentence made Caleb lower his head. 1 month later, the story leaked to the outside, not through vicious gossip, but through legal records. Local newspapers began mentioning Lydia Reid, the woman who had once been erased from the history of Ashford Harbor. The old photographs were verified. The drawings were compared, the transfers were traced line by line. 3 months later, the audit confirmed that Lydia had provided capital, designed, and laid the foundation for the first hotel. Her profit-sharing agreement had never been legally cancelled. Naomi's inheritance account had been closed through a process filled with signs of wrongdoing. The money that should have belonged to her had moved through many accounts, many years, and many layers of signatures. 6 months later, Vivian left the board of directors in silence. No speech, no farewell party, only a brief notice sent to shareholders. Preston lost the succession seat. The investment fund withdrew from the deal. The people who had once called him the future of Ashford began avoiding his eyes in the hallway. For the first time in his life, Preston had to prove he was capable without being protected by the Ashford name. The company website was changed. The brand history section no longer showed only men in suits standing in front of the hotel. In the first position was a photograph of Lydia Reid, her hair blown by the sea wind, her hand holding a design plan, her eyes looking straight at the building she had saved with her money, her talent, and her faith. Naomi did not cry when she saw that photograph hanging in the lobby. She simply stood there for a very long time. Beatrice sat beside her, her aged hands resting on the old leather bag. She said Naomi's mother had always believed that one day her daughter would know she had not been born from lack, but from a woman brave enough to build what others only knew how to take. Naomi used part of the settlement money to create the Lydia Reid Scholarship Fund for young women who wanted to enter hospitality, design, and business. She did not do it to prove she was better than the Ashfords. She did it because her mother deserved to continue existing in dreams no one could erase. That gala night, they thought they were going to announce the new heir of the Ashford family, but what was announced instead was the past they had buried for decades. Vivian had once called Naomi a temporary woman because she believed blood was stronger than documents. She had forgotten that signatures live longer than insults, and records always remember what people try to forget. If you have ever seen a toxic family rewrite the truth and then force the wounded person to stay silent, leave a comment saying, "Records do not lie." Like this video, subscribe to the channel for more dramatic family stories, and tell me whether you would forgive Caleb or walk away forever.